A midnight inferno, hundreds of birds trapped in flames, and a hardened cowboy cradling a tiny chick like spun glass. Cora Hayes didn't share orphan Toby's blood, but she faced wolves and fire to prove that a mother's protective heart cannot be burned away by malice. This gripping story reminds us that a lasting love is forged in the mud, brick by brick. Touch that like button, comment your favorite moment, share, and subscribe to keep these campfire legends alive.
The sun out here did just shine. It punished. Cora Hayes stood in the center of her dirt patch yard. The hot wind whipped her faded skirt around her boots. Dust settled fine and bitter on her lips. She didn't wipe it away. Her hands were full. She was busy gripping a Winchester rifle, pressing the heavy stock hard against her shoulder. 3 men sat on horseback on the other side of her sagging wooden fence, Silas Montgomery's hired muscle. They cast long, ugly shadows across her property. Behind Cora, 17 Rhode Island Reds scratched at the parched earth. To anyone else, they were just birds. To Cora, they were a wall between her and starvation. They were her independence. Silas says your time is up, little lady, the lead rider drawled. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Water rights belong to the Montgomery outfit now. Pack up your birds, or we'll have a turkey shoot. Cora didn't flinch. She thumbed the hammer of the rifle back. The metallic clack cut sharp through the dry wind. You take one step on my land, Cora said. Her voice didn't shake. And your boss is going to be short one rider, maybe 2. The men chuckled. But the sound was thin. They saw her eyes, cold, dead serious. You don't push a cornered animal. And you sure don't push a woman who has nothing left to lose. The lead man tipped his hat, mocking her. We'll be back after sundown, sweetheart. See how brave you are in the dark. They turned their horses and rode off, kicking up a trail of yellow dust. Cora lowered the rifle. Her shoulders slumped, just for a second. The adrenaline drained out of her, leaving her hollow and shaking. She knew she could fight them off forever. Not alone. Not in the dark. That was when she heard the slow, deliberate crunch of hooves. Another rider. He hadn't come from town. He came from the ridge. He'd been sitting up there in the scrub oak, watching Elias Thorne. Every soul in the valley knew the owner of the T-Cross Ranch. He sat tall in the saddle of a massive black gelding. Broad shoulders, a jaw like chipped granite, eyes the color of a winter storm. He didn't wear his wealth, because right now, he didn't have any. His late brother had seen to that. The T-Cross was bleeding money, bleeding cattle, and a brutal winter was coming. Elias rode down to the fence line. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't offer a patronizing smile. He just stopped his horse and looked at her. He looked at the rifle in her hand. Then he looked at the chickens. He studied the reinforced wire on her coops, the clean water troughs, the healthy, copper-red feathers of her flock. They'll be back, Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel under a wagon wheel. I know, Cora said. She kept her chin high. I have enough bullets. Maybe. Elias rested his forearms on the saddle horn. But you can't stay awake forever. And Silas Montgomery doesn't fight fair. Cora tightened her grip on the Winchester. If you're here to offer pity, Mr. Thorne, you can ride on. I don't need charity. Elias didn't blink. I don't deal in charity, Miss Hayes. I deal in survival. He stepped down from his horse. He walked to the fence. He didn't try to cross it. He stood firmly on his side of the boundary. It was a quiet gesture, a deliberate choice. He wasn't invading her space. He was meeting her at the edge of it. My ranch is hurting, Elias said plainly. My brother left behind a mountain of debt. The winter is going to be unforgiving. If I don't find a cash crop or a steady food supply, my men are going to starve before the spring thaw. Cora frowned. What does that have to do with me? You have healthy birds. A good flock. You know how to keep them alive in a place that wants to kill them, Elias said. He looked her dead in the eye. I have land. I have high walls. I have men with guns who can keep Silas Montgomery off your back. He took his hat off. The wind ruffled his dark hair. Be my wife, Elias said. The words dropped between them like a stone in a quiet pond. Bring your flock to the T-cross, he continued. His tone was steady, businesslike. You raise them on my ranch. You get the protection of my name and my men. I get a winter food supply, a fighting chance to save my home. Cora stared at him. The sheer audacity of it left her breathless. A proposal of marriage. No flowers. No sweet promises. Just a cold, hard bargain struck in the dust. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know what I just saw, Elias replied. I saw a woman who doesn't quit, who stands her ground. Out here, that's worth more than romance. That's a partnership. He didn't look at her like a damsel in distress. He didn't look at her with possession. He looked at her like a lifeline, like an equal. I won't rush you, Elias said, settling his hat back on his head. But Silas's men will be back at sundown. You have until then to decide. He tipped the brim of his hat. He mounted his horse with a smooth, practiced grace. I'll be waiting at the courthouse in town at 4 o'clock, Elias said. If you're there, we sign the papers. If you're not, God be with you. Cora, he turned his horse and rode toward town. Cora stood in the dust. The heat shimmered over the dirt road. She looked at her rifle. She looked at her flock. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered what it would feel like to not have to fight the whole world entirely alone. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud, heavy, like a hammer hitting an anvil. Cora sat at her small pine table. The wood was scarred, just like her hands. She stared at the grain, tracing the lines with a calloused thumb. Outside, the Nevada sun was beginning its slow crawl toward the western ridge. The shadows were getting longer. Sundown was coming. Silas Montgomery's men would be back. She looked at her Winchester leaning against the doorframe. She knew how to shoot, but she also knew how to count. 3 men today, maybe 6 tonight. She had 1 rifle, 1 pair of eyes. She couldn't stay awake forever. Elias Thorne's words echoed in the quiet cabin. Be my wife. It wasn't a question. It was a lifeline thrown into deep water. But Cora knew about lifelines. Sometimes they were just nooses in disguise. She closed her eyes. The heat of the cabin faded. Suddenly, she was back east. The suffocating drawing rooms, the smell of cheap gin and expensive cigars, the debtor who had bought her father's debts, and then tried to buy her. She remembered the feeling of being owned, of being a line item on a ledger, a piece of property. She had run 2,000 miles to escape that feeling. She had built this tiny farm out of dirt, sweat, and sheer will, to sign her name on a marriage certificate to a man she didn't know. It felt like putting the shackles back on. A sharp knock at the back door broke the silence. Cora jumped, her hand instinctively dropping toward the hunting knife on the table. Who is it? It's me, Miss Cora. It sends Toby. Cora exhaled. She pulled the bolt back and opened the door. Toby stood there. He was 12 years old, but he looked 8. Scrawny dirt smudged across his cheeks. His clothes hung off him like rags on a scarecrow. He was out of breath, his chest heaving. Toby, what's wrong? You should be in town. I ran, the boy gasped. He pushed past her into the cabin, looking over his shoulder like the devil himself was on his heels. I heard them. Miss Cora, Silas's men. They were at the saloon. Cora grabbed a tin cup, poured some water from the pitcher, and handed it to him. Slow down. Drink. What did you hear? Toby gulped the water. His hands were shaking. They ain't just coming to burn your coops tonight. Silas got the sheriff on his payroll. They got papers. They're gonna take the land. And they're gonna take me. Cora's blood ran cold. Take you where? The county orphanage, Toby whispered. The fear in his eyes was raw, real. The orphanage in Reno wasn't a home. It was a work camp for unwanted boys, the ones who went in rarely came out right. If they came out at all. Toby had been sleeping in Cora's barn for 6 months. She fed him. He helped with the chickens. He was a stray, and so was she. They had an understanding. Silas knew that. He knew taking the boy would break her. Cora looked at Toby. Then she looked at the ticking clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. The choice wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the boy. It was about the birds. It was about survival. Go to the barn, Cora said. Her voice was suddenly very calm. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Hitch the mule to the wagon. Load the feed. Leave the water troughs for last. Where are we going? Toby asked, his eyes wide. We're going to the courthouse, Cora said. She picked up her rifle. We're going to make a deal. The ride into town was a dusty, miserable affair. The chickens clicked and clucked nervously in their wooden transport crates in the back of the wagon. The old mule took its time, unaffected by the urgency burning in Cora's chest. She held the reins with white knuckles. The town of Verde wasn't much to look at, a single main street lined with false front buildings, baking in the sun. The courthouse stood at the end of the street. It was a sturdy brick building, solid, unforgiving. Elias Thorne was there. He was leaning against a wooden post on the boardwalk. He rolled a cigarette between his fingers, taking his time. When he saw her wagon pull up, he didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just struck a match on the heel of his boot, lit his smoke, and stepped down into the dust. He walked over to the wagon. He looked at the crates. Then he looked at Toby, who was shrinking back in the wagon bed. The boy comes with me, Cora said. Her voice was tight. Elias took a long drag of his cigarette. I figure a growing ranch can always use an extra set of hands. He can muck stalls for his keep. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He just accepted it. You ready, Miss Hayes? Elias asked. Let's get it over with, Cora said. They walked into the courthouse. It was cool inside, smelled of old paper and stale sweat. The county clerk was a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent scowl. He looked at Elias. Then he looked at Cora. His eyes lingered on her dusty skirt and her calloused hands. You're sure about this, Elias? The clerk asked, his tone dripping with judgment. It's sudden. Just write the papers. Harold, Elias said. The gravel in his voice made the clerk flinch. Harold pulled out a heavy ledger. He dipped a pen in an inkwell. The scratching sound filled the room. It sounded like a cage door swinging shut. Cora felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. Her breath went shallow. She was doing it again. She was signing her life over to a man. The panic started to rise in her chest, thick and suffocating. Elias saw it. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer a soothing, empty promise. Instead, he took the pen from Harold and held it out to her. Read it first, Elias said quietly. Cora took the pen. She looked down at the ledger. The words blurred for a second, then came into focus. Standard vows. To have and to hold. Sickness and health. She looked up at Elias. The panic receded, replaced by a fierce, blazing fire. She needed to make this clear. Right here, right now. Before God, the law, and this stoic cowboy. Before I sign this, Cora said. Her voice was loud enough to echo off the high plaster ceiling. Harold the clerk stopped shuffling his papers. Elias met her gaze, his gray eyes unreadable. I am agreeing to a partnership. Elias Thorne, Cora said, pronouncing every syllable with lethal precision. I am bringing my flock to your land to save your men from a hard winter. But let us be absolutely clear. She pointed the tip of the pen at the paper. My body is my own. My flock is my own. This marriage certificate does not make me your property. It does not make me a subordinate. It does not give you the right to command me like one of your ranch hands. I am a free woman. I will work your land, and I will feed your men. But I will not be owned. Silence hung heavy in the room. The clerk looked scandalized. His mouth hung open. Well, I never shut up. Harold, Elias said. He didn't even look at the clerk. He was looking at Cora. The hard lines around Elias's mouth softened. Just a fraction. It wasn't a smile. It was something better. It was respect. I don't want a pet, Cora, Elias said slowly. I want a partner. A woman who can stand her ground against Silas Montgomery isn't a woman who needs a master. You keep your birds. You keep your autonomy. We work together to survive. You have my word. He held out his hand, not to take hers in a romantic embrace, but to shake, like a businessman closing a deal. Cora looked at his large, rough hand. She took it. His grip was firm, warm, grounding. She turned to the ledger. She pressed the pen to the paper, and with a steady hand, she signed her name, Cora Hayes. For the last time. Done, Elias said. He dropped a silver dollar on the clerk's desk. Come on, we have a long ride to the T-Cross, and the wind is turning cold. The T-Cross did just sit on the land. It commanded it. Cora sat on the hard wooden seat of her wagon, Toby shivering quietly beside her. The mule plodded along behind Elias' massive black horse. They had been riding for 2 hours, climbing higher into the foothills. The air here was different, thinner, sharper. It bit at Cora's cheeks. They crested a ridge, and the ranch spread out before them. It was vast. Thousands of acres of rolling pasture, bordered by jagged pine-covered mountains. In the center sat the main compound, a large 2-story timber house, a massive barn, bunkhouses, corrals. But as they got closer, Cora saw the truth. The paint was peeling on the main house. The fences sagged in places. The cattle in the near pasture looked thin, their ribs showing through their winter coats. The T-Cross was a giant, but it was a wounded one. Elias rode through the main gate. Cora followed. The sound of the wagon wheels drew the ranch hands out of the bunkhouse and the barn. There were about 10 of them, hard men, dust-covered, their faces weathered by wind and whiskey. They wore sheepskin coats and carried 6-shooters low on their hips. They stopped what they were doing. They stared. Elias reined in his horse. He didn't dismount. He looked down at his men. Listen up. Elias's voice carried over the wind. This is Cora. She's my wife. And this is Toby. They live here now. She's bringing a poultry operation to the T-Cross. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. A tall man with a broken nose and a chew of tobacco in his cheek stepped forward. Judson. He looked at the wooden crates in the back of the wagon. He heard the nervous clucking of the hens. Judson spat into the dirt. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. Wife. Well, congratulations. Boss. But chickens. We running a petting zoo now. Winter's coming. Elias, we need beef and bullets, not birdseed. A few of the other men snickered. They looked at Cora. They didn't see a partner. They saw a desperate woman and a desperate boss. They saw a joke. Cora felt her cheeks flush. The old instinct to shrink, to hide, flared up in her chest. But she swallowed it down. She tightened her grip on the reins. She waited for Elias to say something, to defend her, to demand their respect. Elias looked at Judson. Then Elias looked at Cora. His gray eyes were steady, calm. He didn't yell at his men. He didn't pull rank. Set up your coops behind the main barn. Cora, Elias said evenly. It blocks the north wind. Then he spurred his horse and rode toward the main house. He left her there, in the middle of the yard, surrounded by a dozen cynical, mocking men. Toby looked up at her, terrified. Miss Cora, what do we do? For a second, Cora felt a flash of pure anger at Elias. He abandoned me. He brought me here and left me to the wolves. But then she understood. If Elias had ordered the men to respect her, it would be fake. It would be forced. They would obey the boss. But they would always see her as a fragile thing that needed protecting. Elias wasn't treating her like a damsel. He was treating her like an equal. Out here, respect wasn't handed to you on a silver platter. You had to earn it in the dirt. Cora snapped the reins. Giddy up, she told the mule. She drove the wagon past Judson and the staring men. She didn't look down. She kept her spine straight. She pulled the wagon behind the massive barn, just where Elias had said. The wind was immediately cut in half. It was a good spot. All right, Toby, Cora said. climbing down. We don't have much daylight. The birds need shelter before the freeze hits tonight. Let's get to work. There was an old, collapsed shed against the back of the barn. Piles of salvaged lumber and rusted chicken wire. It was going to be a brutal job. Cora took off her shawl. She rolled up her sleeves. She grabbed a heavy wooden post and started dragging it into position. The work was grueling. The wood was old, heavy, and splintered. The ground was hard as iron, fighting every strike of the shovel as she tried to dig post holes. Toby worked beside her, his small face set in grim determination. An hour passed. The sun dipped lower. The temperature plummeted. Cora's hands were taking a beating. She didn't have heavy work gloves. The rough wood tore at her palms. A massive splinter drove deep into the meat of her thumb. She hissed in pain, pulling it out with her teeth. Blood welled up, bright red against the dirt. She wiped it on her skirt and picked up the hammer. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of her hammer echoed across the ranch yard. Judson and two other hands walked by, carrying saddles toward the tack room. They paused, watching her struggle with a heavy roll of wire fencing. "Looks heavy, little lady," Judson called out. "Careful you don't break a nail." The men laughed and kept walking. Cora didn't stop. She didn't glare at them. She just swung the hammer harder. The wire sliced a shallow cut across her forearm. She ignored it. She focused on the birds. They were shivering in their crates. They needed warmth. Up on the second-floor balcony of the main house, Elias stood in the shadows. He watched her. He had been watching her for an hour. He saw her bleeding hands. He saw the sweat freezing on her brow. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to walk down there, to grab the hammer out of her hand, to order Judson and the boys to build that coop. It would be so easy. His hand gripped the wooden railing. He squeezed until his knuckles went white. No, Elias told himself. He remembered her words at the courthouse. I will not be owned. I will not be a subordinate. If he went down there and saved her, he would be stripping her of her agency. He would be proving the men right that she was just a weak woman who needed the boss to fight her battles. Elias knew the code of the West better than anyone. A person's worth was measured by the weight they could carry without asking for help. He had to let her carry it. It was the hardest thing he had done all year. It was an act of profound, silent respect. Down in the dirt, Cora drove the last nail into the frame. The makeshift coop wasn't pretty, but it was solid. It was windproof. She and Toby carefully moved the 17 Rhode Island Reds from the crates into the new enclosure. She scattered fresh straw and poured their feed. The hens clucked happily, settling into the dry warmth. Cora stood back. Her whole body ached. Her hands were bruised, bloody, and raw. Her dress was ruined. But the birds were safe. She turned around and looked up at the main house. Elias was still standing on the balcony. Even in the fading light, she could see him. He wasn't moving. He was just looking down at her. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But he reached up and touched the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate gesture. Cora took a deep breath. The freezing Nevada wind whipped her hair across her face. She wiped the blood from her hand, stood tall, and walked toward the house. She had built her ground. Now it was time to claim her place inside. The frost didn't just arrive. It locked the valley in a vise. By December, the Nevada sky turned the color of dirty iron. The wind howled down from the peaks, carrying needles of ice that bit through denim and wool alike. Out on the range, the T-Cross cattle were suffering. The creeks were frozen solid. The grass was buried under 6 inches of crusty, frozen snow. Elias' men spent 12 hours a day in the saddle, hacking at ice with axes just so the steers could drink. Morale in the bunkhouse was dying. It was a slow, freezing death. Every evening, the men rode into the yard, their faces caked with white frost, their boot soles cracked from the cold. They were exhausted. Cash was tight, and the ranch's supply wagon from town was running light. Dinner had dwindled to salt pork, old beans, and chicory coffee that tasted like boiled dirt. The men ate in silence. their eyes hollow, staring at their tin plates, except Cora's corner of the ranch. Every morning, before the sun even cleared the ridge, Cora was out behind the barn. She didn't complain about the dark. She didn't complain about the ice. She had wrapped the outside of her makeshift coop in heavy gunny sacks to seal the gaps. She had Toby haul dry dead leaves from the creek bed to double the bedding. And then she did what no one else thought to do. She took the lard scraps from the kitchen, mixed them with warmed oats, and fed it to her hens. High energy, pure fat, it kept their internal furnaces burning through the sub-zero nights. On a Tuesday morning, when the thermometer on the porch read 5 below, Cora walked into the coop. The air inside was thick with the warm, musky smell of feathers and straw. She slipped her hand under a copper-feathered hen. The bird clucked, a soft vibrating sound. Cora felt it, smooth, oval, heavy, and incredibly warm. She pulled her hand out. Nestled in her palm was a large, brown egg, perfect, not a single crack. Beside her, Toby let out a low whistle. Golly, Miss Cora, in this weather, a well-fed bellies keep a bird happy. Toby, Cora said, her breath plumed white in the air. You treat an animal right. You respect its needs, and it'll take care of you. Doesn't matter if it's a 1,000-pound steer or a 2-pound hen. Nature rewards decency. By noon, Cora had collected 12.5 eggs. She didn't keep them for herself. She didn't hide them in the main house. She carried the basket straight into the kitchen where Rosa was staring blankly at a pot of gray beans. Rosa looked up, her old eyes widening as Cora set the basket on the flour-dusted table. The brown shells gleamed like polished wood under the oil lamp. God in heaven, Rosa whispered, touching one with a trembling, flour-coated finger. Fresh eggs. Now use them for the men tonight. Rosa, Cora said simply. They reworking themselves to the bone. They need real fuel. That night, the bunkhouse door banged open. The hands filed into the dining hall, their boots dragging, expecting the same gray beans. But the air in the room didn't smell like old lard. It smelled rich, savory. Rosa marched out carrying 2 massive iron skillets. Inside, a mountain of yellow scrambled eggs bubbled in butter, flecked with chunks of salted beef and wild onions Cora had dried in the fall. Beside it sat a pot of thick, golden broth made from an older hen that had stopped laying. Judson dropped his hat onto the floor. He stared at the table like he was looking at a mirage. Where do we get this? The supply wagon ain't due till Friday. Rosa crossed her arms, nodding toward the corner table where Cora sat quietly beside Elias. Don't thank the wagon, Judson. Thank the lady you were laughing at last month. Her birds laid every single one of those. Judson looked at the yellow eggs. Then he looked at Cora. His face turned the color of a beet. He swallowed hard, his pride fighting his stomach. His stomach won. He sat down, loaded his plate, and took a massive bite. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't the silence of despair anymore. It was the quiet of men being saved. Elias sat beside Cora, his plate piled high. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at his men. For the first time in weeks, their shoulders weren't hunched. They were talking. They were laughing. The gray tint was leaving their skin. He leaned closer to Cora, his shoulder brushing hers. You did a big thing today, Cora, Elias said. His voice was low, meant only for her. Cora took a sip of her tea. I just did my job. Elias, we're partners. Remember, your men are my men now. If they fall, the T-cross falls. And I don't intend to let this place slide into the dirt. Elias looked down at his plate. He nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. He didn't say thank you, because out here, action spoke louder than gratitude. But when he looked back up, his eyes held a deep, unshakable reverence for the woman sitting beside him. The blizzard hit 3 days after Christmas. It wasn't a normal snowstorm. It was a whiteout. The wind screamed off the Sierra Mountains, tearing shingles off the barn roof and piling snowdrifts 12 feet high against the corrals. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Midnight came, and Cora couldn't sleep. The timbers of the main house groaned under the pressure of the gale. She sat by the dying embers of the fireplace, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the wind. It wasn't the wind. It was a high, panicked screech, a chorus of them. The chickens. Cora stood up so fast her chair tipped backward. She grabbed her Winchester from the wall and bolted for the front door. As she yanked it open, a wall of freezing white air hit her, knocking her back a step. Cora, stop! Elias appeared from the dark hallway. He was already wearing his heavy sheepskin coat, his boots laced, a lantern in one hand and his Colt revolver in the other. He grabbed her arm before she could step into the storm. "It's a whiteout," Elias shouted over the gale. "You'll lose your bearings in 10 feet. The birds are dying." Cora screamed back, her eyes wild with panic. "Something is in the coop. I have to go." Elias looked at her face. He saw the sheer, unyielding desperation. He knew those 17 birds were her soul. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous for a woman. He gripped her shoulder hard. "We go together. Hand on my belt. Don't let go. If we get separated, you stay put. Understand?" Cora nodded, her teeth already chattering from the cold. They stepped off the porch into the abyss. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from Cora's lungs. The snow was up to her knees, heavy and wet. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see the ground. She just focused on the dark shape of Elias back ahead of her. Her fingers locked into the leather of his gun belt. They crawled through the drifts, using the fence line as a guide. The screeches from the coop grew louder, sharp and terrified, mixing with a low, savage snarling sound. Wolves. But as Elias swung the lantern toward the coop, the yellow light caught something else. The wire fencing hadn't been torn down by wild animals. It had been cleanly cut, snipped with iron shears. A heavy leather glove lay dropped in the snow nearby. Silas Montgomery's men. They hadn't just lure wolves. They had cut the perimeter to let the predators do their dirty work. 2 massive gray wolves were inside the run, their jaws snapping, feathers flying through the air in a bloody cloud. 3 hens already lay still in the crimson-stained snow. Rage, hot and blinding, boiled up in Cora's chest, wiping away the cold. She didn't hesitate. She threw the Winchester to her shoulder. Squinting through the driving snow, she tracked the shape of the largest wolf. Bang! The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The flash illuminated the snowstorm for a split second. The large gray wolf yelped, dropped to its side, and thrashed in the snow before going still. The second wolf spun around, its eyes reflecting the yellow lantern light like 2 burning coals. It bared its fangs and lunged straight over the broken fence toward Cora. Bang! Elias' Colt roared beside her ear. The bullet caught the beast mid-air, dropping it heavily into the drift a mere 2 feet from Cora's boots. Its dark blood seeped out, smoking against the frozen white ground. Silence returned, save for the howling wind. Cora dropped to her knees in the snow, her rifle forgotten. She scrambled through the broken gate into the coop. "Toby, help me," she cried out, forgetting the boy was safe in the bunkhouse. Elias knelt beside her. He set the lantern down, its light casting long, dancing shadows across the wreckage. He didn't say a word. He just used his large, gloved hands to gently clear the splintered wood and torn wire. Cora dug into the straw. She pulled out a trembling, terrified hen. Its wing was bleeding, but it was alive. She held it against her chest, her tears freezing on her cheeks. They cut the wire. "Elias," Cora whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of grief and fury. "Silas did this. He tried to destroy them. He tried to destroy me." Elias picked up the remaining birds, one by one, checking them over with surprising gentleness. Out of 17, 14 were left alive. He placed them carefully back into the deepest corner of the intact shelter, blocking the broken door with a heavy timber. Then he turned to Cora. He stood up, towering over her in the dark storm. He reached out, took her by her upper arms, and pulled her gently but firmly out of the snow. He didn't hug her. He didn't offer hollow romantic comfort. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her frozen skin. "Listen to me, Cora," Elias said. His voice was steady as a mountain, cutting right through her panic. "They didn't destroy you. Look around. You're still standing. Your birds are still breathing. Silas Montgomery thinks he can break people by breaking their things. But he doesn't understand what you're made of." He reached out, his rough, gloved thumb gently wiping a frozen tear from her cheek. "A person's dignity isn't kept in a wooden cage, Cora," Elias said, his eyes burning with a quiet, fierce intensity. "It's kept right here, in your chest. He can burn the coops, he can cut the wire, but he can't touch who you are unless you let him. And I am telling you right now, we are going to rebuild this, bigger, stronger, and we're going to make him regret the day he ever looked across our fence line." Cora looked up at him. The trembling in her chest stopped. The cold didn't feel so heavy anymore. In the middle of a freezing Nevada blizzard, surrounded by blood and feathers, she looked into Elias Thorne's storm-gray eyes and felt an absolute, unshakable sense of security. She nodded, her jaw setting into that familiar, stubborn line. "Tomorrow," she said. "We start building tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Elias agreed. He picked up the lantern, took her hand in his, and led her back through the whiteout, toward the warmth of the home they were finally beginning to share. The spring melt came fast, turning the hard Nevada dirt into a thick, sucking mud, but the T-Cross didn't slow down. Cora's poultry operation had expanded. The 14 hens that survived the winter blizzard had become a symbol. The hands called them the Iron Flock. Elias had kept his promise. Together with Toby and 2 of the younger cowboys, they had built 3 new, massive coops behind the barn. They used thick pine logs and double-layered wire. No wolf was getting through. No man with iron shears could do it quietly. By May, the ranch was shipping crates of fresh eggs and dressed hens twice a week to the silver mining camps up near Reno. The money was steady. It wasn't like cattle money, which came once a year if you were lucky and didn't lose half the herd to rot or rustlers. This was cash, hard, silver coin. It paid the hands on time. It bought flour, sugar, and real coffee. The mood in the valley was shifting, and Silas Montgomery didn't like the direction of the wind. It was a Thursday afternoon when the first blow fell. Elias was in the tack room, oiling a headstall, when Judson rode into the yard. His horse was lathered, breathing hard. Judson didn't even wait to dismount properly. He slid out of the saddle and banged open the tack room door. "Elias," Judson panted, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. "We got trouble at the Valley Pass. Sheriff Miller is out there. Got a couple of deputies and a couple of Montgomery's riders with him. They've blocked the road." Elias set the leather strap down. His movements were slow, but his eyes went dark. "On what grounds?" "Says the supply wagons are violating some county ordinance about transporting livestock," Judson said, spitting into the straw. "It says a lie." "Elias, Silas bought him off. They re-seizing the egg crates, turning our wagons back." Elias didn't yell. He didn't curse. He walked over to the gun rack on the wall and pulled down his Winchester. He checked the magazine, his face set like concrete. "Get the boys. Judson, saddle up." "No," the voice came from the doorway. Cora stood there. She had a basket of fresh eggs on her hip, her apron stained with yolk and dirt, but her posture was straight as a gun barrel. Elias stopped, the rifle held across his chest. "Cora, this is men's business. Silas is choking our throat. I'm going to open it up. You go out there with guns, Elias, and you give him exactly what he wants," Cora said. She walked into the room, setting the basket down on a hay bale. She stood right between him and the door. "Sheriff Miller is wearing a badge. You shoot a deputy, and Silas legally takes this whole ranch while you hang from a gallows in Reno. So we just sit here and let him starve us out." Elias's voice was a dangerous growl. "Let him take your work." "No," Cora said, her voice dropping, steady and sharp. "We fight him with our brains, not our lead. Silas is powerful because he controls the main road, but he doesn't control the people. The Miller family down the creek, the O'Briens, The webs they all hate Silas. He's been squeezing them for water for 5 years. Elias shook his head, his hand still tight on the rifle. They small-time farmers. Cora, they scared. They're scared because they're alone. Cora fired back, stepping closer to him. She placed her bare hand right over the cold steel of his rifle barrel, pressing it down. Equality and justice aren't things we wait for a crooked judge or a bought sheriff to give us. Elias, they are things we build ourselves, from the ground up, by standing together. We don't go to town to fight them. We bring the valley together. We pool our wagons. We form a cooperative. Let's see Miller arrest 20 families at once while the newspaper in Reno is watching. Elias stared at her. The anger in his chest was hot, a lifetime of Western instinct telling him to settle disputes with gun smoke. But looking at Cora, he saw something bigger. He saw a leader. He saw a strategy that didn't end with a row of graves on the hill. He looked down at her hand on his rifle. He exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Judson," Elias called out, never taking his eyes off his wife. "Yeah, boss. Leave the rifles in the rack," Elias said. "Go ride to the O'Brien place. Tell them we're holding a meeting at the T-Cross tonight. Tell them there's hot broth, fresh bread, and a way out from under Montgomery's boot." Judson looked at Cora, a deep grin breaking across his broken nose. He touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am," he said to Cora, then turned and ran for his horse. That night, the main house at the T-Cross was packed to the walls. 20 families sat on benches, chairs, and the floor. They looked tired, defensive, and suspicious. But as Cora stood up before them, holding an egg ledger in one hand and a map of the back trail passes in the other, they listened. She spoke plainly. No big words. No political speeches. She told them how much the silver mines were willing to pay for food. She showed them how they could bypass Montgomery as roadblock by using the old timber trails on the T-Cross land. She offered them a share in the shipping network she had built. "We are independent people," Cora told the quiet room, her voice carrying into the rafters. "But independence doesn't mean standing alone until you break. It means having the freedom to choose your partners. If we stand together, Silas Montgomery cannot buy enough badges to stop us." An old farmer in the back stood up, his joints cracking. He looked at Elias, then at Cora. "The lady speaks the truth. Elias, my father didn't cross the plains to be a tenant farmer to a land hog. I'm in, one by one." The hands went up. By midnight, the Valley Cooperative was born. It wasn't a victory won with bullets. It was a victory won with a shared purpose. Elias stood by the window, watching the lanterns of the neighbors' wagons bobbing away into the dark. He walked over to Cora, who was wiping down the long wooden table. "You're a fierce woman, Cora Thorne," he said quietly. Cora looked up, a soft smile softening her tired eyes. "I'm just a woman who knows what it's like to be pushed around, Elias. And I know that the only way to stop a bully is to make the ground beneath his feet shake." Elias reached out, his large hand covering hers on the towel. He didn't pull her close, but the warmth of his grip said everything. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof to survive a winter. They were two pillars holding up a whole valley. The victory was sweet. But in Nevada, sweetness never lasted long. By midsummer, the cooperative was running smooth. 6 wagons, guarded by rotating crews of armed hands from the different ranches, moved through the mountain trails every Tuesday. Silas Montgomery's roadblock became an expensive joke. The sheriff's deputies spent their days swatting flies in the sun while the wealth of the valley moved right around them. But Silas wasn't a man to accept a defeat gracefully. He was a snake, and when a snake can bite the horse, it goes for the heel. It happened on a hot Tuesday morning. Toby had been sent into town on the small buckboard wagon to pick up a shipment of specialized poultry medicine that had come in on the train from Sacramento. He was supposed to be back by noon. By 3 o'clock, the wagon hadn't returned. Cora stood on the porch, her eyes scanning the shimmering horizon. Her heart was a tight, heavy knot in her chest. He should be here. Elias Toby is never late when it comes to the birds. Elias emerged from the barn, his face grim. He had already saddled his black horse in Judson S. Bay. Judson found the buckboard 2 miles out. The mule was tied to a cottonwood tree. The wagon was empty. Cora's breath hitched. She didn't say a word. She ran inside, grabbed her bonnet and her rifle, and met Elias at the hitching post. They rode into the town of Verdi at a hard gallop, the dust rising behind them like a storm. They found Toby behind the livery stable. He was lying in the dirt, curled into a tight ball. His face was unrecognizable, swollen, bruised and covered in dried crusts of blood. His shirt was torn, showing angry purple welts across his small ribs. He was breathing in short, ragged gasps, whimpering in his unconscious state. The package of medicine was gone. Cora dropped out of the saddle before her horse had even stopped moving. She fell into the dirt beside the boy, pulling his head into her lap. Toby, oh God, Toby, look at me. The boy's swollen eyelids fluttered open. Just a fraction. Miss Cora, he choked out, coughing up a bright spray of red. They said to tell the T-Cross, that the price of doing business just went up. Rage pure, murderous, and blinding hit Cora like a wave. She looked up at Elias. Elias was standing over them. His face wasn't angry. It was empty. The kind of empty that happens right before lightning strikes. His hand was resting on the carved ivory grip of his Colt. He turned on his heel, heading straight toward the saloon where Silas Montgomery's men usually drank. Elias, no! Cora screamed, her voice tearing her throat. Elias stopped, his back stiff. They laid hands on a child. Cora, they did this to hurt us. I am going to end it. Look at him, Cora shouted, her tears tracking tracks through the dust on her face. He's dying. Elias, you going over there and killing 2 cowboys isn't going to fix his lungs. Help me get him to the doctor. Elias stood there for 3 long seconds, his whole body vibrating with the effort to restrain his violence. Finally, he let out a harsh breath, turned back, and carefully scooped Toby's frail body into his massive arms. They carried him to the town clinic. The sign on the door read Dr. J. Mitchell. Inside, the office was clean, smelling of carbolic acid. Dr. Mitchell, a soft-handed man with a gold watch chain across his vest, was sitting at his desk, reading a medical journal. When Elias kicked the door open and laid Toby on the leather examination table, Mitchell didn't move. He looked at Toby's rags, then at Elias' dusty trail clothes. I can't treat him. Elias, Mitchell said, his voice flat, dismissive. He didn't even stand up. Cora pushed past Elias, her knuckles white on her rifle. What do you mean you can't treat him? He's a child. He's bleeding from his mouth. He's a vagrant boy, Mitchell said, adjusting his glasses. He doesn't belong to anyone. Silas Montgomery pays the retainer for this clinic, and he's made it clear that my services are for the tax-paying citizens of this county, not for street rats. The room went dead silent. Cora felt a cold, hard clarity settle over her. This wasn't just about Silas anymore. This was about the world they were living in, a world where a man in a clean shirt could look at a dying child and see a 0 on a balance sheet before she could speak. Elias moved. He didn't draw his gun. He walked over to the desk, grabbed Mitchell by his silk lapels, and lifted the grown man completely out of his chair with one hand. He slammed him down onto the examination table, right next to Toby's bleeding head. With his other hand, Elias drew his Colt revolver and pressed the heavy, cold iron barrel right against Mitchell's ear. Elias, Mitchell shrieked, his face turning a pasty white. This is assault. I'll have the law on you. The law ain't in this room. Doc, Elias said. His voice was a flat, conversational whisper that made the hairs on Cora's neck stand up. You listen to me, you educated coward. An orphan's blood bleeds just as red as Silas Montgomery's. A human life doesn't carry a price tag in this valley anymore. You are going to fix this boy. You are going to use every powder, every bandage, and every ounce of your skill. If his breath stops, your heart stops right after it. Do you understand the mathematics of that? Mitchell looked into Elias's storm-gray eyes. He saw the absolute certainty of his own death if he said no. He nodded rapidly, his teeth chattering. I'll get my bag. Put the gun away. Elias, please. Elias lowered the hammer of the gun but didn't holster it. He stepped back, standing by the door like a sentinel. Cora moved to the side of the table, taking Toby's small, cold hand in hers. She looked across the boy's battered body at her husband. Elias breathing hard, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the doctor's frantic movements. She spent her whole life being afraid of men with guns. She had spent her life running from the kind of power that comes from violence. But as she watched Elias use his strength to force the world to treat a helpless child with dignity, she realized something profound. Power wasn't the enemy. It was the intent behind it. Elias wasn't fighting for land tonight. He wasn't fighting for his cattle or his pride. He was fighting for the right of a Mofat boy to stay alive in a world that wanted to discard him. He's going to be all right, Cora, Elias whispered after an hour had passed, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. Cora squeezed Toby's hand, looking up at the man she had married out of a desperate bargain. The cowboy who had ridden into her dirt yard looking for a winter supply of food had become something entirely different. He had become her protector, her partner, her equal in the darkest parts of the world. I know, Cora said softly, her voice steady in the quiet clinic, because we won't let them break us. Not now, not ever. The heat of late August didn't just sit over the valley. It pressed down like a hot branding iron. Toby was back at the T-cross, sitting on the porch with a bandaged rib cage and a stubborn smile, tossing cracked corn to the hens. He was alive. The doctor had done his job, and the Valley Cooperative was stronger than ever. We had 30 families shipping through our network now. Silas Montgomery was losing his grip on the territory, and everyone knew a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. It was a Monday night. The air was dead, heavy with the scent of dry pine and incoming electricity. A summer storm was brewing in the mountains, but it hadn't broken yet. Cora was at the kitchen table, her fingers moving rhythmically over the ledger pages under the dim oil lamp. Elias was across from her, cleaning his rifle with a piece of oiled flannel. It was our quiet time, a peaceful rhythm we had carved out of the wilderness. Then the horses started screaming. It wasn't the sound they made when a coyote slunk past the corral. This was a high, shrill terror. Elias stood up so fast his chair clattered against the pine floor. He didn't say a word. He just caught the scent in the wind before he even reached the window. Smoke, rich, greasy, pinewood smoke. The coops, Cora whispered, her face going stark white in the lamplight. They bolted out the door together, tearing into the darkness. The night sky wasn't black anymore. Behind the massive timber barn, a brilliant, angry orange glow was pulsing into the clouds. The main chicken coop, the big one that housed over 300 birds, and the season's new hatches, was completely engulfed in flames. Fire Elias' voice boomed across the yard, cutting through the roar of the wind. All hands. Get the buckets. Now the bunkhouse door flew open. 10, 15, 20 men poured out into the dirt, some barefoot, some still pulling on their boots. In the past, these hard-bitten cowboys would have laughed at a burning chicken coop. They were cattlemen. They didn't care about birds. But tonight was different. Tonight they ran. Judson was the first one to the well, his broken nose twitching as he hauled the heavy iron crank. Form a line, he roared. Don't let it reach the main barn. Move your hides. Boys, the heat was a physical wall, forcing Cora back as she neared the wire perimeter. Inside the burning structure, the screeching was deafening. Hundreds of birds were trapped behind the heavy pine doors, their wings beating frantically against the wood as the roof began to shower sparks down upon them. We have to open the latch, Cora screamed, her throat burning from the smoke. She lunged forward, her apron catching a stray spark. Elias grabbed her by the waist, yanking her back just as a flaming crossbeam crashed down right where she had been standing. It's too hot. Cora, the timber's ready to give. I am not letting them burn. Elias, she cried, twisting in his grip. They everything we built. Elias didn't argue. He looked at the blazing door, then looked at Judson. Judson, wet me down. Judson slammed a full bucket of well water straight over Elias' head and shoulders. Drenched and steaming, Elias grabbed at a heavy wool saddle blanket from the hitching post, threw it over his face, and charged straight into the smoke. Cora's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. She watched the dark silhouette of her husband disappear into the orange furnace. A second later, there was a loud, splintering crack. Elias had thrown his entire weight against the scorched cedar door, shattering the iron latch. The barrier gave way. A wave of heat and smoke erupted from the opening, and with it, a panicked, squawking torrent of feathers. Hundreds of chickens poured out of the inferno, their wings singed. Scrambling blindly into the darkness of the yard, Elias stumbled out right behind them, his wool blanket smoldering, coughing violently as he collapsed into the dirt. Cora was by his side in an instant, dragging him away from the heat, using her hands to beat out the small sparks on his shirt sleeves. He looked up at her, his face black with soot, his eyebrows singed. He gave her a weak, ragged nod. Got most of 'em, he gasped. Meanwhile, the cowboys were working like a well-oiled machine. They weren't just fighting to save property. They were fighting with a strange, fierce tenderness. Cora watched through the haze as Judson, a man who had killed 2 men in his youth and could rope a wild steer by its horns, reached into a burning pile of brush. He pulled out a tiny, shivering yellow chick, barely an inch big. His massive, calloused hands, scarred from decades of rope burns, cradled the tiny bird like it was made of spun glass. He tucked it gently inside his flannel shirt, right against his chest, before grabbing another bucket of water. The battle lasted until 2 in the morning, when the fire finally died down to a pile of glowing, pulsing red coals. The main coop was gone. Nothing but black ash and twisted metal wire remained. But the barn was safe. The main house was safe. And out of 300 birds, more than 200 had been scattered across the safety of the dark pastures. The hands stood around the perimeter, their faces lank with sweat, black soot smeared across their skin. They were exhausted, but their spirits weren't broken. Judson walked over to Cora, his shirt bulging. He unbuttoned his top 2 buttons and carefully placed 3 tiny, soot-stained chicks into her apron pocket. They read tough little bastards. "Ma'am," Judson said, his voice rough from the smoke. He didn't offer a joke. He didn't mock the birds. He looked at her with a quiet, solid reverence, just like their owner. "We'll help you start digging the new foundations come sunrise." Cora looked at the cowboys. She looked at their blackened hands, their ruined shirts, and the gentle way they were herding the surviving hens into the empty horse stalls. The educational value of that night wasn't spoken in a classroom. It was written in the dirt. These men had learned that a life was a life, that an honest day's labor deserved protection, no matter how small the creature. The old toxic pride of the cattle range had burned away in that fire, replaced by something much larger, a shared dignity. Elias stood up, resting his hand on Cora's shoulder. His grip was steady. "Silas thinks he can burn us out," he muttered, looking at the ashes. But he forgot one thing. Wood burns, steel melts, but the people don't break when they re-standing together. Cora took one of the tiny chicks from her pocket, holding its warm, vibrating body against her palm. He wanted a war. "Elias," she said, her voice turning to ice, "tomorrow we give him one. But we aren't using guns. We're using the law." The county courthouse in Verdi was packed to the doors by 9 o'clock Tuesday morning. The air inside was stifling, smelling of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the nervous sweat of 100 Valley residents. Silas Montgomery sat at the front table on the right side of the aisle. He looked immaculate. A clean white shirt, a black broadcloth suit, a gold nugget watch fob dangling proudly from his vest pocket. He had his lawyers with him, 2 sharp-faced men from San Francisco who looked at the local farmers like they were insects. Sheriff Miller stood by the side door, his hand resting casually on his belt, his badge shining under the high windows. They thought it was a done deal. They thought the fire had broken the T-cross, And today was the day they legally seized the Valley's water rights under the guise of an old territorial claim. The circuit judge, an elderly man named Thayer with a long white beard and eyes like flint, slammed his wooden gavel down. Bang, bang. Order in the court, Judge Thayer croaked. We are here to arbitrate the property dispute between the Montgomery Land Holding Company and the residents of the Northern Valley Pass. Mr. Montgomery, state your claim. Silas' lawyer stood up, his voice smooth as oil. He spoke for 20 minutes about charters, investments, and the progress of the territory. He painted a picture of a modern Nevada that had no room for small-time chicken farmers and failing cattle ranches. He presented a petition signed by the sheriff, declaring the Valley Cooperative a public nuisance and a threat to county commerce. When he sat down, the lawyer gave a small, arrogant nod to the room. Judge Thayer adjusted his spectacles. Does the defense have a spokesperson? Elias Thorne stood up from the left table. He wasn't wearing his trail clothes today. He wore a clean, dark coat, his dark hair combed back. He didn't look like an outlaw. He looked like a citizen, but he didn't step forward to speak. Instead, he turned and extended his arm to Cora. The crowd whispered. A woman speaking in a property court was unheard of in these parts. Silas Montgomery let out a soft, mocking chuckle, but Cora didn't look at him. She stood up, her spine rigid, carrying a heavy, leather-bound ledger in her arms. She walked right to the center of the bar, facing the judge's high bench. Your Honor. Cora's voice wasn't loud, but it had a clear, rhythmic resonance that made the room go quiet. My husband, Elias Thorne, has given me the authority to speak for the T-Cross and the 30 families of the Valley Cooperative. We are not here to dispute Mr. Montgomery's wealth. We are here to establish our rights. Silas' lawyer stood up, sneering. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A woman has no legal standing in a structural commerce dispute. Sit down. Counselor. Judge Thayer barked, his flinty eyes fixed on Cora. Out here, steals and sweat decide who owns the dirt, not your city rules. Let the lady speak. Cora opened the heavy ledger, laying it flat on the wooden railing. This book contains the daily records of the T-Cross poultry operation for the last 18 months, Cora said, her finger tracing the ink lines. It shows that while the cattle market fluctuated and left many ranches in debt, this valley produced over 40,000 dozen eggs and 6,000 head of breeding stock. We supplied the silver mines. We fed the railroad workers. We brought $20,000 in hard coin into this county. She turned her head, looking straight at Silas Montgomery. Her eyes were two burning coals, and every dollar of that wealth was distributed equally among the families who worked for it. Cora continued, her voice rising, filling every corner of the high plaster room. We did not use our money to buy sheriffs. We did not use it to bribe deputies or hire thugs to beat 12-year-old boys in the dark. We used it to buy seed, to build schools, to pay honest wages to men who want nothing more than to stand on their own 2 feet. The crowd behind her murmured, a low, rumbling sound of agreement. Silas' face lost its smug expression. His jaw tightened. The law of this territory was written to protect the industrious, not the predatory, Cora said. Turning back to the judge, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a charred, twisted piece of iron wire, the latch from the burning coop. She slammed it down on the wooden rail with a sharp, metallic clack. Last night, Mr. Montgomery's men tried to answer our ledgers with kerosene, Cora said, her voice dropping to a deadly, rhythmic whisper. They burned our coops. They tried to murder 300 living creatures to break our spirit, but they failed. They failed because equality and human rights aren't things that can be consumed by fire. Your Honor, they aren't privileges that a wealthy man can grant or withhold from us on a whim. They are our birthright as human beings who tame this wilderness. She stepped closer to the bench, looking up at Judge Thayer. We did not cross the plains to exchange one set of masters for another, whether a man runs 10,000 head of cattle, or whether a woman raises 17 chickens on a dirt patch. Their sweat, their labor, and their dignity before the law are exactly the same. If this court does not protect that truth today, then there is no law in Nevada. There is only the rule of the gun. Silence fell over the courtroom. Total, heavy, absolute. You could hear the wind rattling the high glass windows. Toby sat in the front row, his small chest heaving with pride. Elias stood by his table, his gray eyes shining with an intensity that could have cut through steel. Judge Thayer sat back in his large leather chair. He looked at the charred piece of wire on the rail. Then he looked at Silas Montgomery, who was leaning over, whispering furiously to his trembling lawyers. The judge didn't take long. He didn't need to. He took his wooden gavel, raised it high, and brought it down with a sound like a rifle shot. Bang! This court finds the Montgomery Land Holding Company's claims to be fraudulent, predatory, and void, Judge Thayer announced, his voice booming through the room. The water rights remain with the Northern Valley Cooperative. Furthermore, Sheriff Miller, you will surrender your badge to this court before noon today. A grand jury will be called to investigate the arson at the T-Cross Ranch. This court is adjourned. The room erupted. The farmers and cowboys didn't yell or throw their hats. They stood up in a massive, solid wall, their faces fierce with a quiet, triumphant satisfaction. They had won, not with lead, but with truth. Silas Montgomery stood up, his face pale and twisted with spite. He tried to walk down the center aisle, but the farmers didn't move out of his way. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a human barrier of honest labor, forcing the tyrant to push his way out through the back door like a common thief. Cora stood at the railing, her hands trembling as she began to close her ledger. Elias was there before she could turn around. He didn't say a word. He didn't care about the crowd or the lawyers. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands catching her by the waist, and lifted her completely off her feet, holding her against his chest. You did it, Cora, Elias whispered into her hair, his voice rough and thick with an emotion he had hidden for 32 years. You saved us. You saved the whole valley. Cora held onto his shoulders, her tears finally falling, warm and clean against his coat. We did it. Elias, she said, her voice matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Together, as partners. And as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright, blinding Nevada sunshine, the whole valley was waiting for them, their hats raised, their faces turned toward the dawn of a new, free land. The autumn wind carried the scent of crisp pine and incoming frost, but the T-Cross Ranch didn't feel cold anymore. It felt alive. A year had passed since the dawn at the Verde courthouse. Silas Montgomery Empire had been dismantled piece by piece, his hired thugs scattered to the winds. The Valley Cooperative was no longer just a defensive alliance. It was a thriving community. 6 new timber barns dotted the northern ridge. The high timber trails were now well-worn roads, smooth from the steady passage of cooperative supply wagons. At the center of it all, behind the massive main barn of the T-Cross, stood the new poultry empire. It was a magnificent sight. 3 long, sturdy coops built from white pine logs, fitted with proper glass windows to let the winter sun in, and double-layered wire buried 3 feet into the dirt to keep out any burrowing varmints. Over 500 birds, Rhode Island Reds and Plymouth Rocks, now roamed the vast, fenced-in pastures. Their copper and speckled feathers gleamed like polished stones under the midday sun. Toby, now 13 and standing a full 2 inches taller, was whistling as he carried a bucket of warmed mash toward the breeding pens. His ribs had healed straight, and his eyes had lost that hollow, hunted look of a stray. He belonged here. Everyone knew it. Cora stood by the fence line, a wicker basket nestled against her hip. She was watching a young mother from a neighboring homestead show her little girl how to gently gather eggs without frightening the brooding hens. Cora smiled. It was a soft, unburdened look that had taken a long time to reach her face. They're settling in well for the winter. A low rumble spoke beside her. Elias, he had approached silently, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. He was leading his big black gelding, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his skin bronze from a long summer spent working the range. They are, Cora said, leaning her shoulder against his arm. They know they're safe here. Elias, animals can tell when the ground beneath them is solid. Elias looked out over the sprawling coops. Then he looked at the vast pastures where his cattle were grazing, fat and healthy, their winter coats coming in thick. The ranch was debt-free now. The steady, weekly silver coin from Cora's egg business had saved the cattle operation, and the cattle operation provided the muscle to expand the poultry lines. They weren't two separate businesses anymore. They were two parts of one living organism. "Come inside with me," Elias said, his voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic tone he used when his mind was set on something important. "I have something to show you." They walked into the main house. The old parlor had changed over the last year. Rosa had polished the timber floors until they shone. Fresh calico curtains hung at the windows, and the scent of roasting beef and rosemary drifted from the kitchen. It was no longer a bleak shelter where a lonely cowboy slept between shifts. It was a home. Elias walked over to the long oak table. Laid out on the polished wood was a large, crisp piece of parchment. It carried the official blue seal of the state of Nevada. Cora approached. Setting her basket down, she looked at the elegant, ink-scripted words at the top of the page. Deed of absolute ownership and joint partnership. The T-Cross Estate. She read the names written below. Elias Thorne. Cora Thorne. "What is this?" "Elias," Cora whispered, her breath catching in her throat. Elias stepped up behind her, his large, calloused hands resting gently on her shoulders. He didn't pull her back. He just stood there, giving her his warmth, letting her feel his presence. "It says a new deed," Elias said plainly. "I had the county recorder draw it up last week. It legally transfers exactly 50% of every acre, every timber, every steer, and every coop on the T-Cross into your name." Cora turned around to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old ghost of her past flared up for a split second, the fear of being trapped by a man's legal maneuvers. "We signed a marriage contract, Elias. I don't need a piece of paper to know I live here. This isn't about marriage." "Cora," Elias said, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intense, unshakable honesty. He reached down and took both her hands in his grip firm and grounding. "Our marriage started as a bargain, a desperate gamble in the dust to survive a winter. But you didn't just survive here. You built this place. You stood in the yard and bled to keep those birds alive. You stood before a federal judge and gave this whole valley its dignity back." He squeezed her hands, his voice dropping an octave, rhythmic and steady as a heartbeat. "Out here, a man doesn't own his wife's labor. He doesn't command her like a piece of livestock. True partnership isn't about a woman changing her name and living under a man's roof. It's about standing on the exact same patch of dirt, looking at the same horizon, and owning the harvest together. You are my equal, Cora, in the eyes of God, the law, and my own soul. This paper just tells the rest of the world what I already know." Cora looked down at their joined hands, his large, scarred from ropes, hers smaller, scarred from wire and timber. The explicit truth of his words washed over her, clearing away the last lingering shadow of her past. She wasn't the broken girl who had run from the debtor back east. She wasn't a tenant on a stranger's ranch. She was a creator, a builder, a full legal owner of her own destiny. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but thick with a profound, healing peace. She leaned in, and for the first time since they had met in that dusty yard 18 months ago, she kissed him with an unburdened heart. It wasn't a kiss born of adrenaline or fear. It was a slow, deep promise, the merging of two distinct, fiercely independent spirits who had chosen to walk the same trail. Elias' arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her against his chest like she was the most precious treasure the Nevada mountains had ever yielded. Later that evening, as the sun began its glorious drop behind the Sierra peaks, painting the sky in deep shades of gold, violet, and crimson, they sat together on the front porch. Toby was down by the corral, showing Judson a trick he had learned for gentling a nervous colt. Judson was listening to the boy, nodding seriously, his arms slung over the fence rail. The actions of the whole ranch spoke the final, unspoken lesson of their journey. Sincerity had replaced suspicion. Tenderness had replaced the old, violent pride of the frontier. The ultimate truth of their story resonated in the quiet twilight. A lasting love isn't born from a sudden, reckless spark. It doesn't grow in a vacuum of sweet words and empty promises. A true Western romance is forged in the mud. It is built brick by brick, through shared hardships, mutual respect, and honoring one another's independent strength. Cora leaned her head onto Elias' shoulder, watching the first evening stars prick through the purple sky. No regrets. Cora, Elias murmured into the darkness, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Cora smiled, her fingers locking tightly with his. Not a single one. Cowboy, we took a gamble on a handful of feathers and a crazy proposal. And we built a kingdom. Elias chuckled, a warm rolling sound that vibrated through his chest. A kingdom of chickens. He joked softly. The best kind. Cora agreed, leaning closer into his side. And there, under the endless, free expanse of the western sky, the cowboy and the chicken farmer watched the night settle over the land they had conquered together, heirs to a legacy of love, equality, and an enduring partnership that would outlast the very mountains above them.
By continuing to watch or listen to this story, viewers acknowledge that the content is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. The author and creators assume no responsibility for misunderstandings, emotional reactions, or interpretations arising from the dramatic content presented in the narrative. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of Cora Hayes and Elias Thorne's long trail, or perhaps more accurately, the true beginning of the legacy they carved together out of the raw Nevada dirt. As an old writer who has spent a lifetime putting the trials, the dust, and the quiet triumphs of the frontier into words, I look at Cora's story, and I don't just see a tale of survival. I see the very definition of what it means to build a home in a wild country. You see, the history books often tell us that the West was won exclusively by iron, by cattle barons, and by the loudest guns. But if you listen closely to the whispers in the sagebrush, you'll find that the frontier was actually held together by something far more durable: the unyielding dignity of a woman's independent soul. When Silas Montgomery's hired muscles stood at Cora's sagging wooden fence, they looked at her faded skirt and saw an easy mark, a desperate woman they could squeeze off her land with the threat of a gun. But Cora possessed a currency that no landhog could ever buy. By thumbing that Winchester rifle and refusing to flinch, she established her very first boundary. She proved that desperation does not have to make a human being small. And then there was Elias Thorne, a man carved from chipped granite, drowning in his late brother's debts, standing on a ranch that was bleeding life. Elias didn't ride down from that ridge to offer her a patronizing fairy tale. The frontier doesn't have time for pretty illusions. He offered her an honest trade. He looked at her, and didn't see a damsel in distress. He saw a lifeline, an equal, and a woman with an iron will. What is the ultimate lesson? The deep human value that this story leaves on our slate tonight. It is this: true strength is not measured by the force of a tyrant's gun, but by the conviction of your character. A lasting love and a true community are not born from a reckless spark, but are forged in the mud through shared hardships, absolute autonomy, and mutual respect. Think of how Cora changed that ranch. When Elias left her in the yard to build her coop surrounded by a dozen mocking, cynical cowboys, he wasn't abandoning her. He was giving her the ultimate gift: her own agency. He knew that out here, respect wasn't handed to you on a silver platter. It had to be earned in the dirt. By rolling up her sleeves and swinging that hammer until her hands bled, Cora showed those men what she was made of. She turned the iron flock into the very fuel that saved the T-Cross from starvation. And think of the lesson those hard-bitten cowboys learned. The educational value of that terrible December blizzard wasn't spoken in a classroom. It was written in the black ash of the yard. When a man like Judson, a rough cowboy who had killed 2 men in his youth, cradled a tiny, soot-stained chick inside his flannel shirt like it was made of spun glass, the old toxic pride of the range burned away. He and the rest of the hands learned that an honest day's labor and a living soul deserve protection, no matter how small the creature.